Alright, and we are on the first video that I'm going to probably publish for my unihertz Titan on the supposedly Odd Crosswind channel. It could be marchscarf, Diggs, or Tony Cashman, who knows. Anyways, we're going to talk about the 3 pros and cons for both subjective and objective. You may have seen me talk about this before, and I'll talk about it yet again, but I think I got good ones right now that can't last in 3 minutes or less, so sorry CapCut, we're going to have to cut off that for now. No pun intended. If I don't remember the list off the top of my head, I'll have to go back to the app real quick just to check. If this doesn't stay on the recording, I'll just have to do one step at a time. Otherwise, we'll start with what I think I remember. So, the first item we have is... teleport in my room. Subjective pro number 1, non-judgment. So, we tend to think of subjective being a thought of mind of things that don't exist in material reality, but the definition of subjective I'm going to use for this video's sake is the kind where you think about things in the immaterial reality that are not having to be only subject to not existing. We're going to talk about things that don't technically exist but still happen to have meaning in our lives, whether we choose to have that meaning or not, or even if it's inherently there. I'm going to work with that definition, even if it's not the actual definition or what have you. We're going to start with what my first item is for me is non-judgment. And what is non-judgment is when you simply don't judge, but more than that is when the absence of thinking that something has to already be a certain way, or has already been confirmed, or has already no reason to be investigated. That is non-judgment for me. It is that patience of mind where you don't have to have the answer, even if you think you know what can be sustainable and stable with the current answer you have, and without having to experiment with other ideas, you still are grateful for what you have as an answer, or progress, or a stability, but you don't judge otherwise, and if not the whole time. So why is non-judgment important? What I'll tell you is that you don't want to have to necessarily judge everything, but the grand thing about even being non-judgment in itself within that is that you're able to process and be patient and take in the things and information that you could otherwise not have been able to do with the judgment you should be able to use properly and helpfully in other areas of your life. When you're non-judgmental, you're accepting that things that may or may not have an answer to them don't have to already be accustomed to themselves or to your own life. You don't have to already know what you're doing to have a good judgment. But even without that, you don't have to be worried about too much. Life doesn't have to be taken seriously. It's nice if you do take it seriously, in my opinion, but it doesn't have to be. And when people tell you, for example, that people don't necessarily always need advice, they at least need people to listen. That is true. There's always going to be moments like that suck, but they're true. They bear truth. You have to make sure that you know how to be careful with people who don't need your advice. But at the same time, when you're not needing to only have that advice, the listening has its own bearings of fruit that help out. And it's not supposed to be a burden for that sake. You can always know when the listening is has its own right to make sense in that situation, for it to be non-judgmental. Now, there's not to say that advice always is judgmental. It's not to say that listening is always non-judgmental, but that's just an example I would give. So, non-judgment is my first pro of subjectiveness. So, for the next item of subjective pros, we have invigoration. This is not a relevant situation to be in to cover invigoration. If I honestly wanted to cover this any better, I would have been outside for this instead of non-judgment, but whatever. Well, actually, no, non-judgment was my room. Okay, but see what I mean? I'm very confused. But yeah, we're going to cover invigoration in this segment of the video. So, I'm in the bathroom, and it's not relevant to the video, but it's invigorating, so whatever. It could have been creativity too, but... So what's invigoration? It's when you have a way to fuel yourself with any amount of energy given the source that you have for the invigoration. You can't use a definition for the word, whatever. Word for definition. It's that's my definition of it, is invigorating things would be things that give you energy from the source of therein. It is whatever you derive strength from. You draw strength from something that, within the same word definition, invigorates you. If you know that eating the candy doesn't make you quite as invigorated. Could mean anything at that point. Could be perspective drawn. Drawn perspective is not just drawn strength or energy, but you know that the energy does not help you feel good. Well, that could be just an attitudinal thing. Even if it's literally not giving you the ATP, for that matter, of literal energy, you still can. That's even if even literal science is a thing, but it should be, but maybe not. Different stuff I'm throwing. There's different perspectives being drawn from how the energy isn't being drawn from the candy. You say that there's no energy being drawn from the candy, well, you might think you mean that literally, but the attitude can still be married to that perspective, because the whole thing can fall apart or build together if you think of it with attitude. But the invigoration of candy being good or bad, whether it leans on the pleasure of you not being hard on yourself or the discipline of knowing that taking the candy will help you learn how to avoid it later, or whatever perspective you have at that point, good or bad, you know that it invigorates you in some way or not invigorates you. So that's a good way to define invigoration as well, is what doesn't count as invigoration depends on the person. But for me, my sake, invigoration was things that happen to fuel me depending on the source. The source could be anything, is what I'm trying to say. The source could be anything. Invigoration doesn't have to only be diet, exercise, and sleep. Invigoration doesn't have to not be addiction to dopamine sources or supposedly the wrong thing to do or the bad ineffectivities of life, whatever the heck. There are things that fuel us that we don't even pay attention to or realize consciously. It's a very touchy subject if you think about it, because the whole point of being invigorated is to know and pay attention to what source you're drawing from that happens to be good in your perspective. But if you only know that subjectively, then maybe it won't have to matter what the objective way to see your sources of fuel would be. Now, I can get this objective later, but for subjective, invigoration is drawing strength and energy from a certain source. Oh no, we are in a closet. And I'm still using one earmuff my headset to listen to this. Okay, we're in a closet now, and I'm going to talk about, in less annoying lighting, in this closet, what creativity means in subjectiveness. Now, as a pro, I know I didn't talk too much about any solid examples, even if objective, about the last one, which was invigoration. I didn't even give a good clarity about what I meant about that, as why it was important for subjectiveness, but we can always add this later if we need to. But what is creativity in subjective prose? If you have been any kind of person in your life, growing or evolving, where you knew that making something new out of thin air wasn't supposed to be bad, and giving you that the chance to breathe life, and you know that creating things that are never necessarily only original because nothing's ever truly new, but you still, shout out to the classes for that, thank you classes, you'll know who you are, imagine like, it's probably your channel name, but like, knowing that creativity as a whole is not supposed to be bad. There are cons to it, there are even some evils to it, but we'll get into that in other videos hopefully. But if they even know what they are, or if you or I know what they are. But creativity as a subjective pro, this is going to probably come down to the idea of trusting yourself and knowing that the Pandora's box or the Schrodinger's cat aren't going to stop you from trying to make the best out of a situation, even if the blessing in disguise doesn't have to be for you. What I mean by that is, well, let's just explain the last two word solids I just displayed here. Schrodinger's cat was basically the idea that if you opened a box to find out if there was a cat in it, you could kill the cat or something would happen to the cat, or you would find that there's no cat, or evidence would be destroyed that either proves or disproves that there was a cat inside the box for whatever reason. So the idea of Schrodinger's cat is you can't prove something just by trying to find out all the time. That's always guaranteed. Even if you could prove it, that was the fact that you had to do that was an action orientation. So it had to be done in order to prove it. That reality in itself can be pretty daunting. And then the idea of the Pandora's box, which I did cover this a little bit on Twicashion's alt channel. I'm Anthony, so that's what I'm talking about. But like, the idea of the Pandora's box was that when Pandora opened the box, it released a bunch of horrors and evils all around the world. The only thing that they could save inside the box was the promise of hope, and that was the idea behind taking risks and calculated risks. Was that you have to make sure, in a sincere way, that even if you were to take risks, usually the calculated risks are the ones you want to take, even if that's still being way too careful. But those two ideals, Pandora's box and Schrodinger's cat, are what I'm going to bring up all of a sudden randomly for creativity as a subjective pro. Now, why did I give you all that word salad and all that talking for 3 minutes just to give you an idea of creativity as a subjective good thing? It's because creativity happens like that. You know that something that is new doesn't have to be understood, and something that is new also doesn't have to only be good. The point is that you give it a chance to exist because you say so, and because you know that even if it's not only rational, logic isn't always going to have a place in reality. It doesn't even always have a place in objectiveness. The reality that we understand and the reality that we experience doesn't have to always be the same thing. Creativity is a blessing in disguise as well as just a blessing, because when you make things out of thin air, whether they're original truly or whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, if I didn't contradict myself in the same video clip, when you're creative, when you're being an artist, you're drawing pictures, you're making sculptures, you're doing all these cool things that don't just have to be about art and the fine arts and theaters and stuff like that. Creativity isn't just art, but that's just a solid example that's popular. Anime, manga, whatever. there's your shill. Okay, whatever. That was example enough. Creativity is a very good thing overall, because you know, if even this is an objective way to say it, that when you are being creative, you are giving yourself the chance to experience what you don't understand and give birth to things that don't have to be bad. But even when they are bad or turn out wrong or whatever the hell else, even as you learn from your mistakes, which is already the good thing about that, you know that creativity has its own merits. It should just be what it is. There's a simplicity to creativity that exists as well as the complexion. When you're creative, when you're subjectively good about creativity, and not just being objective about getting the work done with creativity, which I was like that myself before. It's not just other artists, unfortunately. I can't the blame for myself and other people. That's where the way to do it. You know that creativity can be good. The only example I'll give for creativity right now is, again, knowing that risks you take don't have to only be good or bad. So as per the Pandora's box and the Schrodinger's cat, you might as well just try something, even if it's only going to be chemically, inevitably, perpetually, permeatively bad. Who knows if something's irreversible, but as a consequence of being negative. Not all consequences are negative. That can be another weird video. Be creative, please. Don't be hard on yourself. Trust the process, and realize that creativity is just only one of the 3 or more subjective pros that I can think of. There you go. Out of this closet I go.